Okay. Um, well, I'm back. It's been a while, and there are a lot of chapters of American Gods that are missing from the channel. Um, so just to briefly explain what happened there, I was reading them on, I was reading them live on Twitch, and um, the idea was I was gonna download after I recorded it on Twitch. I would download the file and then upload it to YouTube so that it would also be on YouTube. But the problem with that was I kept losing track of time and not downloading them. Um, I wouldn't. By the time remembered to download them, they were like expired already. So I lost a lot of them because they got deleted from Twitch. That's why by the time I was on chapter 16, I started doing the readings here on YouTube Live instead because I didn't want to have to deal with keeping up with. Apparently, I was just incapable of keeping up with the Twitch because I had to like wait for it to process and be available on Twitch and then download it, and it just kept slipping my mind. So I'm trying to fill in the gaps of what chapters are missing. So chapters right now, chapters 5 and 9 through 15, I think, are the ones that they need to be re-recorded. So I'm going back and fixing that. Starting with chapter 5, but there's also like a little interlude thingy before chapter 5, so I'm going to read that first. So yeah, I'll just get right into it and start it. Coming to America, 1721. The important thing to understand about American history, wrote Mr. Ebis in his leather-bound journal, is that it is fictional, a charcoal-sketched simplicity for the children or the easily bored. For the most part, it is uninspected, unimagined, unthought, a representation of the thing and not the thing itself. It is a fine fiction, he continued, pausing for a moment to dip his pen in the inkwell and collect his thoughts, that America was founded by pilgrims seeking the freedom to believe as they wished, that they came to the Americas, spread and bred and filled the empty land. In truth, the American colonies were as much a dumping ground as an escape, a forgetting place. Well, there goes the cat. The cat is doing that. I have my laptop propped up on some pillows, just on my bed. There's the orb. Let's get that back in the frame. So the cat just decided to walk all over everything. I'm gonna move this back a little, actually. Differently. Sorry about that. Okay. Anyway, back to the story. In the days where you could be hanged in London but from Tyburn's triple-crowned tree for the theft of 12 pennies, the Americas became a symbol of clemency, of a second chance. But the conditions of transportation were such that, for some, it was easier to take the leap from the leafless and dance on nothing until the dancing was done. Transportation, it was called. For 5 years. For 10 years. For life. That was the sentence. You were sold to a captain and would ride in his ship, crowded tight as the slavers, to the colonies or to the West Indies. Off the boat the captain would sell you on as an indentured servant to one who would take the cost of your skin out in your labor until the years of your indenture were done. But at least you were not waiting to hang in an English prison, for in those days prisons were places where you stayed until you were freed, transported, or hanged. You were not sentenced there for a term. And you were free to make the best of your new world. You were also free to bribe a sea captain to return you to England before the terms of your transportation were over and done. People did. And if the authorities caught you returning from transportation, if an old enemy or an old friend with a score to settle saw you and peached on you, then you were hanged without a blink. I am reminded, he continued after a short pause, during which he refilled the inkwell on his desk from the bottle of umber ink from the closet and dipped his pen once more, of the life of Essie Tregowan, who came from a chilly little cliff-top village in Cornwall, the southwest of England, where her family had lived from time out of mind. Her father was a fisherman, and it was rumored that he was one of the wreckers, those who would hang their lamps high on the dangerous coast when the storm winds raged, luring ships onto the rocks for the goods on shipboard. Essie's mother was in service as a cook at the squire's house, and at the age of 12, Essie began to work there in the scullery. She was a thin little thing, with wide brown eyes and dark brown hair, and she was not a hard worker, but was forever slipping off and away to listen to stories and tales, if there was anyone who would tell them. Tales of the piskies and the spriggans, of the black dogs of the moors and the seal women of the channel. And though the squire laughed at such things, the kitchen folk always put out a china saucer of the creamiest milk at night, put it outside the kitchen door for the pixies. Several years passed, and Essie was no longer a thin little thing. Now she curved and billowed like the swell of the green sea, and her brown eyes laughed, and her chestnut hair tossed and curled. Essie's eyes lighted on Bartholomew, the squire's 18-year-old son, home from Rugby, and she went at night to the standing stone on the edge of the woodland, and she put some bread that Bartholomew had been eating but had left unfinished on the stone, wrapped in a cut strand of her own hair. And on the very next day, Bartholomew came and talked to her, and looked on her approvingly with his own eyes, the dangerous blue of a sky when the storm was coming, while she was cleaning out the grate in his bedroom. He had such dangerous eyes, said Essie Turgowan. Soon enough Bartholomew went up to Oxford, and when Essie's condition became apparent, she was dismissed. But the babe was stillborn, and as a favour to Essie's mother, who was a very fine cook, the squire's wife prevailed upon her husband to return the former maiden to her former position in the scullery. Even so, Essie's love for Bartholomew had turned to hatred for his family, and within the year she took for her new beau a man from a neighbouring village with a bad reputation, who went by the name of Josiah Horner. And one night, when the family slept, Essie arose in the night and unbolted the side door to let her lover in. He rifled the house while the family slept on. Suspicion immediately fell upon someone in the house, for it was apparent that someone must have opened the door, which the squire's wife distinctly remembered having bolted herself, and someone must have known where the squire kept his silver plate and the drawer in which he kept his coins and his promissory notes. Still, Essie, by resolutely denying everything, was convinced of nothing until Master Josiah Horner was caught in a chandler's in Exeter, passing one of the squire's notes. The squire identified it as his, and Horner and Essie went to trial. Excuse me, I don't know why my nose is suddenly itching like crazy. Sorry. Horner was convicted at the local assizes, and was, as the slang of the time so cruelly and so casually had it, turned off. But the judge took pity on Essie because of her age or her chestnut hair, and he sentenced her to 7 years' transportation. She was to be transported on a ship called the Neptune, under the command of one Captain Clark. So Essie went to the Carolinas, and on the way she conceived an alliance with the self-same captain, and prevailed upon him to return her to England with him, as his wife, and to take her to his mother's house in London where no man knew her. The journey back, when the human cargo had been exchanged for cotton and tobacco, was a peaceful time, and a happy one, for the captain and his new bride, who were as two lovebirds or courting butterflies, unable to cease from touching each other or giving each other little gifts and endearments. When they reached London, Captain Clark lodged Essie with his mother, who treated her in all ways as her son's new wife. 8 weeks later, the Neptune set sail again, and the pretty young bride with the chestnut hair waved her husband good-bye from dockside. Then she returned to her mother-in-law's house, where the old woman being absent, Essie helped herself to a length of silk, several gold coins, and a silver pot in which the old woman kept her buttons, and pocketing these things, Essie vanished into the stews of London. Over the following 2 years, Essie became an accomplished shoplifter, her wide skirts capable of concealing a multitude of sins, consisting chiefly of stolen bolts of silk and lace, and she lived life to the full. Essie gave thanks for her escapes from her vicissitudes to all the creatures that she had been told of as a child, to the pixies, whose influence she was certain extended as far as London, and she would put a wooden bowl of milk on a window ledge each night, although her friends laughed at her. But she had the last laugh, as her friends got the pox or the clap, and Essie remained in the peak of health. She was a year shy of her 20th birthday when fate dealt her an ill blow. She sat in the Crossed Forks Inn off Fleet Street in Bell Yard when she saw a young man enter and seat himself near the fireplace, fresh down from the university. "Oh-ho! A pigeon ripe for the plucking!" thinks Essie to herself, and she sits next to him, and tells him what a fine young man he is, and with one hand she begins to stroke his knee, while the other hand, more carefully, goes in search of his pocket-watch. And then he looked her full in the face, and her heart leapt and sank as eyes the dangerous blue of the summer sky before a storm gazed back into hers, and Master Bartholomew said her name. She was taken to Newgate and charged with returning from transportation. Found guilty, Essie shocked no one by pleading her belly, although the town matrons who assessed such claims, which were usually spurious, were surprised when they were forced to agree that Essie was indeed with child, although who the father was, Essie declined to say. Her sentence of death was once more commuted to transportation, this time for life. She rode out this time on the Sea Maiden. There were 200 transportees on that ship, packed into the hold like so many fat hogs on their way to market. Fluxes and fevers ran rampant. There was scarcely room to sit, let alone to lie down. A woman died in childbirth in the back of the hold, and the people being pushed in too tightly to pass her body forward, she and the infant were forced out of a small porthole in the back, directly into the choppy gray sea. Oh, come on, nose, stop itching. Essie was 8 months gone, and it was a wonder she kept the baby, but keep it she did. In her life ever after, she would have nightmares of her time in that hold, and she would wake up screaming with the taste and stench of the place in her throat. The Sea Maiden landed at Norfolk in Virginia, and Essie's indenture was bought by a small planter, a tobacco farmer named John Richardson, for his wife had died of the childbirth fever a week after giving birth to his daughter, and he had need of a wet nurse and a maid of all work upon his small holding. So Essie's baby boy, whom she called Anthony, after she said her late husband's father, knowing there was none there to contradict her, and perhaps she had known an Anthony once, sucked at Essie's breast alongside of Phillida Richardson, and her employer's child always got first suck. So she grew into a healthy child, tall and strong, while Essie's son grew weak and rickety on what was left. And along with the milk, the children, as they grew, drank Essie's tales, of the knockers and the blue caps who lived down the mines, of the buka, of the trixiest spirit of the land, much more dangerous than the red-headed, snub-nosed piskies, for whom the first fish of the catch was always left upon the shingle, and for whom a fresh-baked loaf of bread was left in the field, at reaping time, to ensure a fine harvest. She told them of the apple-tree men, old apple-trees who talked when they had a mind, and who needed to be placated with the first cider of the crop, which was poured onto their roots as the year turned, if they were to give you a fine crop for the next year. She told them, in her mellifluous Cornish drawl, which trees they should be wary of in the old rhyme. Elm he do brood, and oak he do hate, but the willow man goes walking if you stays out late. She told them all these things, and they believed, because she believed. The farm prospered, and Essie Tregowan placed a china saucer of milk outside the back door each night for the piskies. And after 8 months, John Richardson came a-knocking quietly on Essie's bedroom door, and asked her for favors of the kind a woman shows a man. And Essie told him how shocked and hurt she was, a poor widow woman, and an indentured servant no better than a slave, to be asked to prostitute herself for a man whom she had had so much respect for. And an indentured servant could not marry, so how he could even think to torment an indentured transportee girl so she could not bring herself to think, and her nut-brown eyes filled with tears, such that Richardson found himself apologizing to her, and the upshot of it was that John Richardson wound up in that corridor of that hot summer's night, going down on one knee to Essie Tregowan and proposing an end to her indenture and offering his hand in marriage. Now, although she accepted him, she would not sleep a night with him until it was legal, whereupon she moved from the little room in the attic to the master bedroom in the front of the house, and if some of Farmer Richardson's friends and their wives cut him when they saw him in town, many more of them were of the opinion that the new Mistress Richardson was a damn fine-looking woman, and that Johnny Richardson had done quite well for himself. Within a year she was delivered of another child, another boy, but as blond as his father and his half-sister, and they named him John after his father. The 3 children went to the local church to hear the traveling preacher on Sundays, and they went to the little school to learn their letters and their numbers with the children of the other small farmers, while Essie also made sure they knew the mysteries of the piskies, which were the most important mysteries there were. Red-headed men, with eyes and clothes as green as a river, with turned-up noses, funny, squinting men who would, if they got a mind to, turn you and twist you and lead you out of your way unless you had salt in your pocket or a little bread. When the children went off to school, they each of them carried a little salt in one pocket, a little bread in the other, the old symbols of life and the earth, to make sure they came safely home once more, and they always did. The children grew in the lush Virginia hills, grew tall and strong, although Anthony, her first son, was always weaker, paler, more prone to disease and bad airs. And the Richardsons were happy, and Essie loved her husband as best she could. They had been married a decade when John Richardson developed a toothache so bad it made him fall from his horse. They took him to the nearest town where his tooth was pulled, but it was too late, and the blood poisoning carried him off, black-faced and groaning, and they buried him beneath his favorite willow tree. The widow Richardson was left the farm to manage until Richardson's two children were of age. She managed the indentured servants and the slaves, and brought in the tobacco crop year in, year out. She poured cider on the roots of the apple trees on New Year's Eve, and placed a loaf of new baked bread in the fields at harvest time, and she always left a saucer of milk at the back door. The farm flourished, and the widow Richardson gained a reputation as a hard bargainer, but one whose crop was always good, and who never sold shoddy for better merchandise. So all went well for another 10 years, but after that was a bad year, for Anthony, her son, slew Johnny, his half-brother, in a furious quarrel over the future of the farm and the disposition of Phillida's hand. And some said he had not meant to kill his brother, and that it was a foolish blow that struck too deep, and some said otherwise. Anthony fled, leaving Essie to bury her youngest son beside his father. Now, some said Anthony fled to Boston, and some said he went south to Florida, and his mother was of the opinion that he had taken ship to England to enlist in George's army and fight the rebel Scots. But with both sons gone, the farm was an empty place, a sad one, and Phillida pined and planed as if her heart had been broken, while nothing that her stepmother could say or do would put a smile back on her lips again. But heartbroken or not, they needed a man about the farm, and so Phillida married Harry Solmes, a ship's carpenter by profession, who had tired of the sea and who dreamed of a life on land on a farm like the Lincolnshire farm upon which he had grown up. And although the Richardsons' farm was little enough like that, Harry Solmes found correspondences enough to make him happy. 5 children were born to Phillida and Harry, 3 of whom lived. The widow Richardson missed her sons, and she missed her husband, although he was now little more than a memory of a fair man who treated her kindly. Phillida's children would come to Essie for tales, and she would tell them of the black dog of the moors, and of Rawhead and Bloody Bones, or the apple tree man, but they were not interested. They only wanted tales of Jack, Jack of the Beanstalk, or Jack Giant Killer, or Jack and his cat and the king. She loved those children as if they were her own flesh and blood, although sometimes she would call them by the names of those long dead. It was May, and she took her chair out into the kitchen garden to pick peas and to shuck them in the sunlight, for even in the lush heat of Virginia the cold had entered her bones as the frost had entered her hair, and a little warmth was a fine thing. As the widow Richardson shucked the peas with her old hands, she got to thinking about how fine it would be to walk once more on the moors and salty cliffs of her native Cornwall, and she thought of sitting on the shingle as a little girl, waiting for her father's boat to return from the grey seas. Her hands, blue-knuckled and clumsy, opened the pea-pods, forced the full peas into an earthenware bowl, and dropped the empty pea-pods onto her aproned lap. And then she found herself remembering, as she had not remembered for a long time, a life well lost, how she had twitched purses and filched silks with her clever fingers, and now she remembers the warden of Newgate telling her that it would be a good 12 weeks before her case would be heard, and that she could escape the gallows if she could plead her belly, and what a pretty thing she was, and how she had turned to the wall and bravely lifted her skirts, hating herself and hating him, but knowing he was right, and the feel of the life quickening inside her that meant she could cheat death for a little longer. "Essie Tregowan," said the stranger. The widow Richardson looked up, shading her eyes in the May sunshine. "Do I know you?" she asked. She had not heard him approach. The man was dressed all in green, dusty green trews, green jacket, and a dark green coat. His hair was a carroty red, and he grinned at her, all lopsided. There was something about the man that made her happy to look at him, and something else that whispered of danger. "You might say that you know me," he said. He squinted down at her, and she squinted right back up at him, searching his moon face for a clue to his identity. He looked as young as one of her own grandchildren, yet he had called her by her old name, and there was a burr in his voice she knew from her childhood, from the rocks and the moors of her home. "You're a Cornishman?" she asked. "That I am, a cousin Jack," said the red-haired man, "or rather, that I was, but now I'm here in this new world where nobody puts out ale or milk for an honest fellow, or a loaf of bread come harvest time." The old woman steadied the bowl of peas upon her lap. If you're who I think you are, she said, then I've no quarrel with you. In the house she could hear Phillida grumbling to the housekeeper. Nor I with you, said the red-haired fellow, a little sadly, although it was you that brought me here, you and a few like you, into this land with no time for magic and no place for piskies and such folk. You've done me many a good harm, she said. Good and ill, said the squinting stranger. We're like the wind. We blows both ways. Essie nodded. Will you take my hand, Essie Tregowan? And he reached out a hand to her. Freckled it was, and although Essie's eyesight was going, she could see each orange hair on the back of his hand, glowing golden in the afternoon sunlight. She bit her lip. Then, hesitantly, she placed her blue-knotted hand in his. She was still warm when they found her, although the life had fled her body, and only half the peas were shelled. Okay, and that was the in-between chapter thingy. And I will continue. I don't know what's wrong with my nose. Stop itching. And moving on to chapter 5. Only Zorya Utrenyaya was awake to say goodbye to them that Saturday morning. She took Wednesday's $45 and insisted on writing him out a receipt for it in wide, looping handwriting on the back of an expired soft drink coupon. She looked quite doll-like in the morning light, with her old face carefully made up and her golden hair piled high upon her head. Wednesday kissed her hand. Thank you for your hospitality, my dear lady, he said. You and your lovely sisters remain as radiant as the sky itself. You are a bad old man, she told him, and shook a finger at him. Then she hugged him. Keep safe, she told him. I would not like to hear that you are gone for good. It would distress me equally, my dear. She shook hands with Shadow. Zorya Poluchnaya thinks very highly of you, she said. I also. Careful, cat. Thank you, said Shadow. Thanks for dinner. She raised an eyebrow at him. You liked? You must come again. Wednesday and Shadow walked down the stairs. Shadow put his hands in his jacket pockets. The silver dollar was cold in his hand. It was bigger and heavier than any coins he'd used so far. He classic palmed it, let his hand hang by his side naturally, then straightened his hand as the coin slipped down to a front palm position. It felt natural there, held between his forefinger and his little finger by the slightest of pressure. Smoothly done, said Wednesday. I'm just learning, said Shadow. I can do a lot of the technical stuff. The hardest part is making people look at the wrong hand. Is that so? Yes, said Shadow. It's called misdirection. He slipped his middle fingers under the coin, pushing it into a back palm, and fumbled his grip on it, ever so slightly. The coin dropped from his hand to the stairwell with a clatter and bounced down half a flight of stairs. Wednesday reached down and picked it up. You cannot afford to be careless with people's gifts, said Wednesday. Something like this, you need to hang on to it. Don't go throwing it about. He examined the coin, looking first at the eagle side, then at the face of Liberty on the obverse. Ah, Lady Liberty. Beautiful, is she not? He tossed the coin to Shadow, who picked it up from the air, did a slide vanish, seeming to drop it into his left hand while actually keeping it in his right, and then appeared to pocket it with his left hand. The coin sat in the palm of his right hand in plain view. It felt comforting there. Lady Liberty, said Wednesday. Like so many of the gods that Americans hold dear, a foreigner. In this case, a Frenchwoman, although in deference to American sensibilities, the French covered up her magnificent bosom on that statue they presented to New York. Liberty, he continued, wrinkling his nose at the used condom that lay on the bottom flight of steps, towing it to the side of the stairs with distaste. Someone could slip on that, break their necks, he muttered, interrupting himself. Like a banana peel, only with bad taste and irony thrown in. He pushed open the door, and the sunlight hit them. The world outside was colder than it had looked from indoors. Shadow wondered if there was more snow to come. Liberty, boomed Wednesday, and as they walked to his car, is a bitch who must be bedded on a mattress of corpses. Yeah? Said Shadow. Quoting, said Wednesday. Quoting someone French. That's who they have a statue to in their New York harbor. A bitch who liked to be fucked on the refuse from the tumbril. Hold your torch as high as you want to, my dear. There's still rats in your dress and cold jism dripping down your leg. He unlocked the car and pointed Shadow to the passenger seat. I think she's beautiful, said Shadow, holding the coin up close. Liberty's silver face reminded him a little of Zoria Polonuchnaya. That, said Wednesday, driving off, is the eternal folly of man. To be chasing after the sweet flesh without realizing that it is simply a pretty cover for the bones. Worm food. At night, you're rubbing yourself against worm food. No offense meant. Shadow had never seen Wednesday quite so expansive. His new boss, he decided, went through phases of extroversion followed by periods of intense quiet. So you aren't American? Asked Shadow. Nobody's American, said Wednesday. Not originally. That's my point. He checked his watch. We will still have several hours to kill before the banks close. Good job last night with Chernobog, by the way. I would have closed him on coming eventually, but you enlisted him more wholeheartedly than ever I could have. Only because he gets to kill me afterward. Not necessarily. As you yourself so wisely pointed out, he's old, and the killing stroke might merely leave you, well, paralyzed for life, say. A hopeless invalid. So you have much to look forward to, should Mr. Jernabog survive the coming difficulties. And is there some question about this? Said Shadow, echoing Wednesday's manner, then hating himself for it. Fuck yes, said Wednesday. He pulled up in the parking lot of the bank. This, he said, is the bank I shall be robbing. They don't close for another few hours. Let's go in and say hello. He gestured to Shadow. Reluctantly, Shadow got out of the car and followed Wednesday in. If the old man was going to do something stupid, Shadow could see no reason why his face should be on the camera. But curiosity pulled him in, and he walked into the bank. He looked down at the floor, rubbed his nose with his hand, doing his best to keep his face hidden. Deposit forms, ma'am, said Wednesday to the loan teller. Over there. Very good. And if I were to need to make a night deposit? Same forms, she smiled at him. You know where the night deposit slot is, hon? Left out the main door. It's on the wall. My thanks. Wednesday picked up several deposit forms. He grinned a goodbye at the teller, and he and Shadow walked out. Wednesday stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, scratching his beard meditatively. Then he walked over to the ATM machine and to the night safe set in the side of the wall and inspected them. He led Shadow across the road to the supermarket, where he bought a chocolate fudge popsicle for himself and a cup of hot chocolate for Shadow. There was a payphone set in the wall of the entryway as you went in, below a notice board with rooms to rent and puppies and kittens in need of good homes. Wednesday wrote down the telephone number of the payphone. They crossed the road once more. What we need, said Wednesday suddenly, is snow. A good, driving, irritating snow. Think snow for me, will you? Huh? Concentrate on making those clouds, the ones over there in the west, making them bigger and darker. Think gray skies and driving winds coming down from the Arctic. Think snow. I don't think it will do any good. Nonsense. If nothing else, it will keep your mind occupied, said Wednesday, unlocking the car. Kinko's next. Hurry up. Snow, thought Shadow, in the passenger seat, sipping his hot chocolate. Huge, dizzying clumps and clusters of snow falling through the air, patches of white against an iron-gray sky, snow that touches your tongue with cold in winter, that kisses your face with its hesitant touch before freezing you to death. 12 cotton candy inches of snow, creating a fairy tale world, making everything unrecognizably beautiful. Wednesday was talking to him. I'm sorry, said Shadow. I said we're here, said Wednesday. You were somewhere else. I was thinking about snow, said Shadow. In Kinko's, Wednesday set about photocopying the deposit slips from the bank. He had the clerk instant print him 2 sets of 10 business cards. Shadow's head had begun to ache, and there was an uncomfortable feeling between his shoulder blades. He wondered if he had slept on it wrong, if it was an awkward legacy of the night before's sofa. Wednesday sat at the computer terminal, composing a letter, and with the clerk's help, making several large-sized signs. Snow, thought Shadow. High in the atmosphere, perfect tiny crystals that form about a minute piece of dust. each a lace-like work of unique six-sided fractal art, and the snow crystals clump together into flakes as they fall, covering Chicago in their white plenty, inch upon inch. "Here," said Wednesday. He handed Shadow a cup of Kinko's coffee, a half-dissolved lump of non-dairy creamer powder floating on the top. "I think that's enough, don't you?" "Enough what?" "Enough snow. Don't want to immobilize the city, do we?" The sky was a uniform battleship gray. Snow was coming. Yes. "I didn't really do that," said Shadow. "I mean, I didn't. Did I?" "Drink the coffee," said Wednesday. "It's foul stuff, but it'll ease the headache." Then he said, "Good work." Wednesday paid the Kinko's clerk, and he carried his signs and letters and cards outside to the car. He opened the trunk of his car, put the papers in a large black metal case of the kind carried by payroll guards, and closed the trunk. He passed Shadow a business card. "Who," said Shadow, "is A. Haddock, Director of Security, A1 Security Services?" "You are." "A. Haddock." "Yes." "What does the A stand for?" "Alfredo? Alphonse? Augustine? Ambrose? Your call entirely." "Oh, I see." "I'm James O'Gorman," said Wednesday. "Jimmy to my friends. See, I've got a card too." They got back in the car. Wednesday said, "If you can think A. Haddock as well as you thought Snow, we should have plenty of lovely money with which to wine and dine my friends tonight." "And if we're in jail by this evening?" "Then my friends will just have to make do without us." "I'm not going back to prison." "You won't be. I thought we had agreed that I wouldn't be doing anything illegal." "You aren't. Possibly aiding and abetting, a little conspiracy to commit, followed, of course, by receiving stolen money, but trust me, you'll come out of this smelling like a rose." "Is that before or after your elderly Slavic Charles Atlas crushes my skull with one blow?" "His eyesight's going," said Wednesday reassuringly. "He'll probably miss you entirely. Now, we still have a little time to kill. The bank closes at midday on Saturdays after all. Would you like lunch?" "Yes," said Shadow. "I'm starving." "I know just the place," said Wednesday. He hummed as he drove, some cheerful song that Shadow could not identify. Snowflakes began to fall, just as Shadow had imagined them, and he felt strangely proud. He knew rationally that he had nothing to do with the snow, just as he knew the silver dollar he carried in his pocket was not, and never had been, the moon. But still. They stopped outside a large shed-like building. A sign said that the all-you-can-eat lunch buffet was $4.99. "I love this place," said Wednesday. "Good food?" asked Shadow. "Not particularly," said Wednesday, "but the ambiance is unmissable." The ambience that Wednesday loved, it turned out, once lunch had been eaten, Shadow had the fried chicken and enjoyed it, was the business that took up the rear of the shed. It was the hanging flag across the center of the room announced. It was the hanging flag across the center of the room announced, a bankrupt and liquidated stock clearance depot. Wednesday went out to the car and reappeared with a small suitcase, which he took into the men's room. Shadow figured he'd learn soon enough what Wednesday was up to, whether he wanted to or not, and so he prowled the liquidation aisles, staring at the things for sale. Boxes of coffee, for use in airline filters only. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle toys and Xena Warrior Princess harem dolls. Teddy bears that played patriotic tunes on the xylophone when plugged in, and other teddy bears that played seasonal songs on the xylophone when plugged in. Cans of processed meat, galoshes and sundry overshoes, marshmallows, Bill Clinton presidential wristwatches, artificial miniature Christmas trees, salt and pepper shakers in the shapes of animals, body parts, fruit, okay. Salt and pepper shakers in the shapes of animals, body parts, fruit, and nuns, and Shadow's favorite, a just add real carrot snowman kit with plastic coal eyes, a corncob pipe, and a plastic hat. Shadow thought about how you made the moon seem to come out of the sky and become a silver dollar, and what made a woman get out of her grave and walk across town to talk to you. "Isn't it a wonderful place?" asked Wednesday when he came out of the men's room. His hands were still wet, and he was drying them off on a handkerchief. "They're out of paper towels in there," he said. He had changed his clothes. He was now wearing a dark blue jacket with matching trousers, a blue knit tie, a thick blue sweater, a white shirt, and black shoes. He looked like a security guard, and Shadow said so. "What can I possibly say to that, young man?" said Wednesday, picking up a box of floating plastic aquarium fish. "They'll never fade, and you'll never have to feed them. other than to congratulate you on your perspicacity. How about that, Arthur Haddock? How about Arthur Haddock? Arthur's a good name. Too mundane. Well, you'll think of something. There, let us return to town. We should be in perfect time for our bank robbery, and then I shall have a little spending money. Most people, said Shadow, would simply take it from the ATM, which is oddly enough more or less exactly what I was planning to do. Wednesday parked the car in the supermarket lot across the street from the bank. From the trunk of the car, Wednesday brought out the metal case and a clipboard and a pair of handcuffs. He handcuffed the case to his left wrist. He attached the other end of the cuff to the metal case's handle. The snow continued to fall. Then he put a peaked blue cap on and velcroed a patch to the breast pocket of his jacket. A1 Security was written on the cap and the patch. He put the deposit slips on his clipboard. Then he slouched. He looked like a retired beat cop and appeared somehow to have gained himself a paunch. Now, he said, you do a little shopping in the food store, then hang out by the phone. If anyone asks, you're waiting for a call from your girlfriend whose car has broken down. So why is she calling me there? How the hell should you know? Wednesday put on a pair of faded pink earmuffs. He closed the trunk. Snowflakes settled on his dark blue cap and on his earmuffs. How do I look? He asked. Ludicrous, said Shadow. Ludicrous? Or goofy, maybe, said Shadow. Goofy and ludicrous. That's good. Wednesday smiled. The earmuffs made him appear at the same time reassuring, amusing, and ultimately lovable. He strode across the street and walked along the block to the bank building, while Shadow walked into the supermarket hall and watched. Wednesday taped a large red out-of-order notice to the ATM. He put a red ribbon across the night deposit slot, and he taped a photocopied sign up above it. Shadow read it with amusement. For your convenience, it said, we are working to make ongoing improvements. We apologize for the temporary inconvenience. Then Wednesday turned around and faced the street. He looked cold and put upon. A young woman came over to use the ATM. Wednesday shook his head, explained that it was out of order. She cursed, apologized for cursing, and ran off. A car drew up, and a man got out holding a small gray sack and a key. Shadow watched as Wednesday apologized to the man, then made him sign the clipboard, checked his deposit slip, painstakingly wrote him out a receipt and puzzled over which copy to keep, and finally opened his big black metal case and put the man's sack inside. The man shivered in the snow, stamping his feet, waiting for the old security guard to be done with this administrative nonsense, so he could leave his takings and get out of the cold and be on his way. Then he took his receipt and got back into his warm car and drove off. Wednesday walked across the street, carrying the metal case, and bought himself a coffee at the supermarket. Afternoon, young man, he said with an avuncular chuckle as he passed Shadow. Cold enough for you? He walked back across the street and took gray sacks and envelopes from people coming to deposit their earnings or their takings on this Saturday afternoon, a fine old security man in his funny pink earmuffs. Shadow bought them some things to read, turkey hunting, people, and because the cover picture of Bigfoot was so endearing, the Weekly World News, and stared out of the window. Anything I can do to help? Asked a middle-aged black man with a white mustache. He seemed to be the manager. Thanks, man, but no. I'm waiting for a phone call. My girlfriend's car broke down. Probably the battery, said the man. People forget those things only last 3, maybe 4 years. It's not like they cost a fortune. Tell me about it, said Shadow. Hang in there, big guy, said the manager, and he went into the supermarket. The snow had turned the street scene into the interior of a snow globe, perfect in all its details. Shadow watched, impressed. Unable to hear the conversations across the street, he felt it was like watching a fine silent movie performance, all pantomime and expression. The old security guard was gruff, earnest, a little bumbling perhaps, but enormously well-being. Everyone who gave him their money walked away a little happier from having met him. And then the cops drew up outside the bank, and Shadow's heart sank. Wednesday tipped his cap to them and ambled over to the police car. He said his hellos and shook hands through the open window and nodded, then hunted through his pockets until he found a business card and a letter and passed them through the window of the car. Then he sipped his coffee. The telephone rang. Shadow picked up the handpiece and did his best to sound bored. A1 Security Services, he said. Can I speak to A. Haddock? Asked the cop across the street. This is Andy Haddock speaking, said Shadow. Yeah, Mr. Haddock, this is the police. said the cop in the first car across the street. "You've got a man at the First Illinois Bank on the corner of Market and Second?" Yeah, that's right. Jimmy O'Gorman. And what seems to be the problem, officer? Jim behaving himself? He's not been drinking. No problem, sir. Your man is just fine here, sir. Just wanted to make certain everything was in order. You tell Jim that if he's caught drinking again, officer, he's fired. You got that? Out of a job. Out on his ass. We have zero tolerance at A1 Security. I really don't think it's really my place to tell him that, sir. He's doing a fine job. We're just concerned because something like this really ought to be done by two personnel. It's risky having one unarmed guard dealing with such large amounts of money. Tell me about it. Or more to the point, you tell those cheapskates down at the First Illinois about it. These are my men I'm putting on the line, officer. Good men. Men like you. Shadow found himself warming to this identity. He could feel himself becoming Andy Haddock. Chewed cheap cigar in his ashtray, a stack of paperwork to get to this Saturday afternoon, a home in Schaumburg and a mistress in a little apartment on Lakeshore Drive. You know, you sound like a bright young man, Officer, Meyerson. Officer Meyerson, you need a little weekend work or you wind up leaving the force any reason, you give us a call. We always need good men. You got my card? Yes, sir. You hang on to it, said Andy Haddock. You call me. The police car drove off, and Wednesday shuffled back through the snow to deal with the small line of people who were waiting to give him their money. She okay? Asked the manager, putting his head around the door. Your girlfriend? It was the battery, said Shadow. Now I just gotta wait. Women, said the manager. I hope yours is worth waiting for. Winter darkness descended, the afternoon slowly graying into night. Lights went on. More people gave Wednesday their money. Suddenly, as if at some signal Shadow could not see, Wednesday walked over to the wall, removed the out-of-order signs, and trudged across the slushy road, heading for the car park. Shadow waited a minute, then followed him. Wednesday was sitting in the back of the car. He had opened the metal case and was methodically laying everything he had been given out on the back seat in neat piles. Drive, he said. We're heading for the First Illinois Bank over on State Street. Repeat performance? Asked Shadow. Isn't that kind of pushing your luck? Not at all, said Wednesday. We're going to do a little banking. While Shadow drove, Wednesday sat in the back seat and removed the bills from the deposit bags in handfuls, leaving the checks and the credit card slips and taking the cash from some, although not all, of the envelopes. He dropped the cash back into the metal case. Shadow pulled up outside the bank, stopping the car about 50 yards down the road, well out of camera range. Wednesday got out of the car and pushed the envelopes through the night deposit slot. Then he opened the night safe and dropped in the gray bags. He closed it again. He climbed into the passenger seat. You're heading for I-90, said Wednesday. Follow the signs west for Madison. Shadow began to drive. Wednesday looked back at the bank they were leaving. There, my boy, he said cheerfully. That will confuse everything. Now, to get the really big money, you need to do that about 4:30 on a Sunday morning when the clubs and the bars drop off their Saturday night's takings. Hit the right bank, the right guy making the drop-off, they tend to pick them big and honest, and sometimes they have a couple of bouncers accompanying them, but they aren't necessarily smart. And you can walk away with $250,000 for an evening's work. If it's that easy, said Shadow, how come everybody doesn't do it? It's not an entirely risk-free occupation, said Wednesday, especially not at 4:30 in the morning. You mean the cops are more suspicious at 4:30 in the morning? Not at all, but the bouncers are, and things can get awkward. He flicked through a sheaf of 50s, added a smaller stack of 20s, weighed them in his hand, then passed them over to Shadow. Here, he said, your first week's wages. Shadow pocketed the money without counting it. So that's what you do? He asked. To make money? Rarely. Only when a great deal of cash is needed fast. On the whole, I make my money from people who never know they've been taken, and who never complain, and who will frequently line up to be taken when I come back that way again. That Sweeney guy said you were a hustler. He was right, but that is the least of what I am, and the least of what I need you for, Shadow. Snow spun through their headlights and into the windshield as they drove through the darkness. The effect was almost hypnotic. This is the only country in the world, said Wednesday into the stillness, that worries about what it is. What? The rest of them know what they are. No one ever needs to go searching for the heart of Norway. or looks for the soul of Mozambique. They know what they are. And? Just thinking out loud. So you've been to lots of other countries then? Wednesday said nothing. Shadow glanced at him. No, said Wednesday with a sigh. No, I never have. They stopped for gas, and Wednesday went into the restroom in his security guard jacket with his suitcase, and came out in a crisp, pale suit, brown shoes, and a knee-length brown coat that looked like it might be Italian. So, when we get to Madison, what then? Take Highway 14 west to Spring Green. We'll be meeting everyone at a place called the House on the Rock. You been there? No, said Shadow, but I've seen the signs. The signs for the House on the Rock were all around that part of the world, oblique, ambiguous signs all across Illinois and Minnesota and Wisconsin, probably as far away as Iowa, Shadow suspected, signs alerting you to the existence of the House on the Rock. Shadow had seen the signs and wondered about them. Did the house balance perilously upon the rock? What was so interesting about the rock? About the house? He had given it a passing thought, but then forgotten it. Shadow was not in the habit of visiting roadside attractions. They drove past the Capitol Dome of Madison, another perfect snow globe scene in the falling snow, and then they were off the interstate and driving down country roads. After almost an hour of driving through towns with names like Black Earth, they turned down a narrow driveway, past several enormous snow-dusted flower pots entwined with lizard-like dragons. The tree-lined parking lot was almost empty. They'll be closing soon, said Wednesday. So what is this place? Asked Shadow as they walked through the parking lot toward a low, unimpressive wooden building. This is a roadside attraction, said Wednesday. One of the finest, which means it is a place of power. Come again? It's perfectly simple, said Wednesday. In other countries, over the years, people recognized the places of power. Sometimes it would be a natural formation, sometimes it would just be a place that was somehow special. They knew that something important was happening there, that there was some focusing point, some channel, some window to the imminent. And so they would build temples, or cathedrals, or erect stone circles, or, well, you get the idea. There are churches all across the states, though, said Shadow. In every town, sometimes on every block, and about as significant in this context as dentist offices. No, in the USA, people still get the call, or some of them, and they feel themselves being called to from the transcendent void, and they respond to it by building a model out of beer bottles or somewhere they've never visited, or by erecting a gigantic bat house in some part of the country that bats have traditionally declined to visit. Roadside attractions. People feel themselves being pulled to places where, in other parts of the world, they would recognize that part of themselves that is truly transcendent, and buy a hot dog and walk around, feeling satisfied on a level they cannot truly describe, and profoundly dissatisfied on a level beneath that. You have some pretty whacked out theories, said Shadow. Nothing theoretical about it, young man, said Wednesday. You should have figured that out by now. There was only one ticket window open. We stop selling tickets in half an hour, said the girl. It takes at least 2 hours to walk around, you see. Wednesday paid for their tickets in cash. Where's the rock? Asked Shadow. Under the house, said Wednesday. Where's the house? Wednesday put his finger to his lips, and they walked forward. Farther in, a player piano was playing something that was intended to have been Ravel's Bolero. The place seemed to be a geometrically reconfigured 1960s bachelor pad, with open stonework, pile carpeting, and magnificently ugly mushroom-shaped stained glass lampshades. Up a winding staircase was another room filled with knickknacks. They say this was built by Frank Lloyd Wright's evil twin, said Wednesday. Frank Lloyd wrong. He chuckled at his joke. I saw that on a t-shirt, said Shadow. Up and down more stairs, and now they were in a long, long room made of glass that protruded needle-like out over the leafless black and white countryside hundreds of feet below them. Shadow stood and watched the snow tumble and spin. This is the house on the rock? He asked, puzzled. More or less. This is the infinity room, part of the actual house, although a late addition. But no, my young friend, we have not scratched the tiniest surface of what the house has to offer. So, according to your theory, said Shadow, Walt Disney World would be the holiest place in America. Wednesday frowned and stroked his beard. Walt Disney bought some orange groves in the middle of Florida and built a tourist town on them. No magic there of any kind, although I think there might be something real in the original Disneyland. There may be some power there, although twisted and hard to access. There's definitely nothing out of the ordinary about Disney World, but some parts of Florida are filled with real magic. You just have to keep your eyes open. Ah, for the mermaids of Weeki Wachi. Follow me, this way. Everywhere was the sound of music, jangling, awkward music, ever so slightly off the beat and out of time. Wednesday took a $5 bill and put it into a change machine, receiving a handful of brass-colored metal coins in return. He tossed one to Shadow, who caught it, and realizing that a small boy was watching him, held it up between forefinger and thumb and vanished it. The small boy ran over to his mother, who was inspecting one of the ubiquitous Santa Clauses. Over 6,000 on display, the sign said, and he tugged urgently at the hem of her coat. Shadow followed Wednesday outside briefly, and then followed the signs to the streets of yesterday. 40 years ago, Alex Jordan, his face is on the token you have palmed in your right hand, Shadow, began to build a house on a high jut of rock in a field he did not own, and even he could not have told you why. And people came to see him build it. The curious and the puzzled, and those who were neither and who could not honestly have told you why they came. So he did what any sensible American male of his generation would do. He began to charge them money. Nothing much, a nickel each perhaps, or a quarter. And he continued building, and the people kept coming. So he took those quarters and nickels and made something even bigger and stranger. He built these warehouses on the land beneath the house and filled them with things for people to see, and then the people came to see them. Millions of people come here every year. Why? But Wednesday simply smiled, and they walked into the dimly lit, tree-lined streets of yesterday. Prim-lipped Victorian china dolls stared in profusion through dusty store windows, like so many props from respectable horror films. Cobblestones under their feet, the darkness of a roof over their heads, jangling mechanical music in the background. They passed a glass box of broken puppets and an overgrown golden music box in a glass case. They passed the dentists in the drugstore. Restore potency. Use O'Leary's magnetical belt. At the end of the street was a large glass box with a female mannequin inside it, dressed as a gypsy fortune teller. Now, boomed Wednesday over the mechanical music, at the start of any quest or enterprise, it behooves us to consult the Norns. So let us designate this Sybil our Erd, eh? He dropped a brass-colored house on the rock coin into the slot. With jagged mechanical motions, the gypsy lifted her arm and lowered it once more. A slip of paper chunked out of the slot. Wednesday took it, read it, grunted, folded it up, and put it in his pocket. Aren't you going to show it to me? I'll show you mine, said Shadow. A man's fortune is his own affair, said Wednesday stiffly. I would not ask to see yours. Shadow put his own coin in the slot. He took his slip of paper. He read it. Every ending is a new beginning. Your lucky number is none. Your lucky color is dead. Motto, like father, like son. Shadow made a face. He folded the fortune up and put it in his inside pocket. They went further in, down a red corridor, past rooms filled with empty chairs upon which rested violins and violas and cellos, which played themselves, or seemed to, when fed a coin. Keys depressed, cymbals crashed, pipes blew compressed air into clarinets and oboes. Shadow observed with a wry amusement that the bows of the stringed instruments, played by mechanical arms, never actually touched the strings, which were often loose or missing. He wondered whether all the sounds he heard were made by wind and percussion, or whether they were tapes as well. He had walked for what felt like several miles when they came to a room called the Mikado, one wall of which was a 19th century pseudo-oriental nightmare, in which beetle-browed mechanical drummers banged cymbals and drums while staring out from their dragon-encrusted lair. Currently, they were majestically torturing Saint Saëns' Danse Macabre. Cernabog sat on a bench in the wall facing the Mikado machine, tapping out the time with his fingers. Pipes fluted, bells jangled. I'm going to take a sip of water because I'm getting tongue-tied. The Danse Macabre came to a tempestuous and discordant end. That all the artificial instruments were ever so slightly out of tune added to the otherworldliness of the place. A new piece began. Okay. Sorry. How was your bank robbery? Asked Jernabog. It went well? He stood, reluctant to leave the Mikado and its thundering, jangling music. Slick as a snake in a barrel of butter, said Wednesday. I get a pension from the slaughterhouse, said Jernabog. I do not ask for more. It won't last forever, said Wednesday. Nothing does. More corridors, more musical machines. Shadow became aware that they were not following the path through the rooms intended for tourists, but seemed to be following a different route of Wednesday's own devising. They were going down a slope, and Shadow, confused, wondered if they had already been that way. Jernabog grasped Shadow's arm. Quickly, come here, he said, pulling him over to a large glass box by a wall. It contained a diorama of a tramp asleep in a churchyard in front of a church door. The drunkard's dream, said the label, which explained that it was a 19th century penny-in-the-slot machine, originally from an English railway station. The coin slot had been modified to take the brass house on the rock coins. Put in the money, said Jernabog. Why? Asked Shadow. You must see, I show you. Shadow inserted his coin. The drunk in the graveyard raised his bottle to his lips. One of the gravestones flipped over, revealing a grasping corpse. A headstone turned around, flowers replaced by a grinning skull. A wraith appeared on the right of the church, while on the left of the church, something with a half-glimpsed, pointed, unsettlingly bird-like face, a pale, Boschian nightmare, glided smoothly from a headstone into the shadows and was gone. Then the church door opened, a priest came out, and the ghosts, haunts, and corpses vanished, and only the priest and the drunk were left alone in the graveyard. The priest looked down at the drunk disdainfully, and backed through the open door, which closed behind him, leaving the drunk on his own. The clockwork story was deeply unsettling. Much more unsettling, thought Shadow, than clockwork has any right to be. You know why I show that to you? Asked Jernabog. No. That is the world as it is. That is the real world. It is there in that box. They wandered through a blood-colored room filled with old theatrical organs, huge organ pipes, and what appeared to be enormous copper brewing vats, liberated from a brewery. Where are we going? Asked Shadow. The carousel, said Jernabog. But we've passed signs to the carousel a dozen times already. He goes his way. We travel a spiral. The quickest way is sometimes the longest. Shadow's feet were beginning to hurt, and he found this sentiment to be extremely unlikely. A mechanical machine played Octopus's Garden in a room that went up for many stories, the center of which was filled entirely with a replica of a great black whale-like beast, with a life-sized replica of a boat in its vast fiberglass mouth. They passed on from there to a travel hall, where they saw the car covered with tiles, and the functioning Rube Goldberg chicken device, and the rusting Burma shave ads on the wall. Life is hard. It's toil and trouble. Keep your jawline free from stubble. Burma shave, read one, and he undertook to overtake. The road was on a bend. From now on, the undertaker is his only friend. Burma shave. And they were at the bottom of a ramp now, with an ice cream shop in front of them. It was nominally open, but the girl washing down the surfaces had a closed look on her face, so they walked past it into the pizzeria cafeteria, empty but for an elderly black man wearing a bright check suit and canary yellow gloves. He was a small man, the kind of little old man who looked as if the passing of the years had shrunk him, eating an enormous, many-scooped ice cream sundae, drinking a supersized mug of coffee. A black cigarillo was burning in the ashtray in front of him. 3 coffees, said Wednesday to Shadow. He went to the restroom. Shadow bought the coffees and took them over to Jernabog, who was sitting with the old black man and was smoking a cigarette surreptitiously, as if he were scared of being caught. The other man, happily toying with his sundae, mostly ignored his cigarillo, but as Shadow approached, he picked it up, inhaled deeply, and blew 2 smoke rings. The first one large one, then another smaller one, which passed neatly through the first, and he grinned as if he were astonishingly pleased with himself. Shadow, this is Mr. Nancy, said Jernabog. The old man got to his feet and thrust out his yellow-gloved right hand. Good to meet you, he said with a dazzling smile. I know who you must be. You're working for the old one-eyed bastard, aren't you? There was a faint twang in his voice, a hint of patois that might have been West Indian. I work for Mr. Wednesday, said Shadow. Yes, please sit down. Jernabog inhaled on his cigarette. I, th- mm, 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 mm. I think, he pronounced gloomily, that our kind, we like cigarettes so much because they remind us of the offerings that once they burned for us, the smoke rising up as they sought our approval or our favor. They never gave me nothing like that, said Nancy. Best I could hope for was a pile of fruit to eat, maybe curry goat, something slow and cold and tall to drink, and a big old high titty woman to keep me company. He grinned white teeth and winked at Shadow. These days, said Chernabog, his expression unchanged, we have nothing. Well, I don't get anywhere near as much fruit as I used to, said Mr. Nancy, his eyes shining. But there still ain't nothing out there in the world for my money that can beat a big ol' high titty woman. Some folk you talk to, they say it's the booty you got to inspect at first. But I'm here to tell you that it's the titties that still crank my engine on a cold morning. Nancy began to laugh, a wheezing, rattling, good-natured laugh, and Shadow found himself liking the old man despite himself. Wednesday returned from the restroom and shook hands with Nancy. Shadow, you want something to eat? A slice of pizza or a sandwich? I'm not hungry, said Shadow. Let me tell you something, said Mr. Nancy. It can be a long time between meals. Someone offers you food, you say yes. I'm no longer young as I was, but I can tell you this. You never say no to the opportunity to piss, to eat, or to get half an hour's shut-eye. You follow me? Yes, but I'm really not hungry. You're a big one, said Nancy, staring into Shadow's light gray eyes, with old eyes the color of mahogany. A tall drink of water, but I gotta tell you, you don't look too bright. I got a son, stupid as a man who bought his stupid at a 2-for-1 sale, and you remind me of him. If you don't mind, I'll take that as a compliment, said Shadow. Being called dumb as a man who slept late the morning they handed out brains? Being compared to a member of your family. Mr. Nancy stubbed out his cigarillo, then he flicked an imaginary speck of ash off his yellow gloves. You may not be the worst choice old I could have made, come to that. He looked up at Wednesday. You got any idea how many of us there's going to be here tonight? I sent the message out to everyone I could find, said Wednesday. Obviously not everyone is going to be able to come, and some of them, he said with a pointed look at Chernabog, might not want to. But I think we can confidently expect several dozen of us, and the word will travel. They made their way past a display of suits of armor. Victorian fake, pronounced Wednesday as they passed the glassed-in display. Modern fake, 12th century helm on a 17th century reproduction, 15th century left gauntlet. And then Wednesday pushed through an exit door, circled them around the outside of the building. I can't be doing with all these ins and outs, said Nancy. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I come from warmer climes. Along a covered walkway, in through another exit door, and they were in the carousel room. Calliope music played, a Strauss waltz, stirring and occasionally discordant. The wall, as they entered, was hung with antique carousel horses, hundreds of them, some in need of a lick of paint, others in need of a good dusting. Above them hung dozens of winged angels, constructed rather obviously from female store window mannequins. Some of them bared their sexless breasts. Some had lost their wigs and stared baldly and blindly down from the darkness. And then there was the carousel. A sign proclaimed it was the largest in the world, and said how much it weighed, how many thousand light bulbs were to be found in the chandeliers that hung from it in Gothic profusion, and forbade anyone from climbing on it or from riding on the animals. And such animals! Shadow stared, impressed in spite of himself, at the hundreds of full-sized creatures who circled on the platform of the carousel. Real creatures, imaginary creatures, and transformations of the two. Each creature was different. He saw mermaid and merman, centaur and unicorn, elephants, one huge, one tiny, bulldog, frog and phoenix, zebra, tiger, manticore and basilisk, swans pulling a carriage, a white ox, a fox, twin walruses, even a sea serpent, all of them brightly colored and more than real. Each rode the platform as the waltz came to an end and a new waltz began. The carousel did not even slow down. What's it for? Asked Shadow. I mean, okay, world's biggest, hundreds of animals, thousands of light bulbs, and it goes around all the time, and no one ever rides it. It's not there to be ridden, not by people, said Wednesday. It's there to be admired. It's there to be. Like a prayer wheel going round and round, said Mr. Nancy, accumulating power. So where are we meeting everyone? Asked Shadow. I thought you said we were meeting them here, but the place is empty. Wednesday grinned his scary grin. Shadow, he said, you're asking too many questions. You're paid not to ask questions. Sorry. Now stand over there and help us up, said Wednesday, and he walked over to the platform on one side with the description of the carousel on it and a warning that the carousel was not to be ridden. Shadow thought of saying something, but instead he helped them, one by one, up onto the ledge. Wednesday seemed profoundly heavy. Jernabog climbed up himself, only using Shadow's shoulder to steady himself. Nancy seemed to weigh nothing at all. Each of the old men climbed out onto the ledge, and then, with a step and a hop, they walked out onto the circling carousel platform. Well, barked Wednesday, aren't you coming? Shadow, not without a certain amount of hesitation, had a hasty look around for any House on the Rock personnel who might be watching, swung himself up onto the ledge beside the world's largest carousel. Shadow was puzzled to realize that he was far more concerned with breaking the rules by climbing onto the carousel than he had been aiding and abetting this afternoon's bank robbery. Each of the old men selected a mount. Wednesday climbed onto a golden wolf. Jernabog climbed onto an armored centaur, its face hidden by a metal helmet. Nancy, chuckling, slithered up onto the back of an enormous, leaping lion, captured by the sculptor mid-roar. He patted the side of the lion. The Strauss waltz carried them around, majestically. Wednesday was smiling, and Nancy was laughing delightedly, an old man's cackle, and even the dour Jernabog seemed to be enjoying himself. Shadow felt as if a weight were suddenly lifted from his back. 3 old men were enjoying themselves, riding the world's biggest carousel. So what if they did all get thrown out of the place? Wasn't it worth anything to say that you had ridden on the world's largest carousel? Wasn't it worth it to have traveled on one of those glorious monsters? Shadow inspected a bulldog, and a mer creature, and an elephant with a golden howdah, and then he climbed on the back of a creature with an eagle's head and the body of a tiger, and held on tight. The rhythm of the Blue Danube waltz rippled and rang and sang in his head. The lights of 1,000 chandeliers glinted and prismed, and for a heartbeat Shadow was a child again. And all it took to make him happy was to ride the carousel. He stayed perfectly still, riding his eagle tiger at the center of everything, and the world revolved around him. Shadow heard himself laugh over the sound of the music. He was happy. It was as if the last 36 hours had never happened, as if the last 3 years had not happened, as if his life had evaporated into the daydream of a small child, riding the carousel in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, on his first trip back to the States. A marathon journey by ship and by car, his mother standing there, watching him proudly, and himself sucking his melting popsicle, holding on tightly, hoping that the music would never stop, the carousel would never slow, the ride would never end. He was going around and around and around again. Then the lights went out, and Shadow saw the gods. All right. That's the end of Chapter 5, and Chapter 6 should be already there, and so I'll be back with Chapter 7. So it's, doesn't make a difference to you watching, I guess, but it's kind of convoluted. But thanks for watching, and enjoy as the readings continue.